The suitcase, it moved. I swear to God, it moved. I thought I was losing my goddamn mind, standing there by that cursed lake where my husband used to fish, where I've spent countless afternoons trying to forget the pain that's been eating me alive for years. But when I heard that faint cry from the water, that desperate, muffled sound that cut through my soul like a rusted knife, I knew I wasn't going crazy. I knew something evil was happening right in front of my eyes. Before I tell you what I found in that suitcase, what horror was hidden beneath that dark green canvas that nearly destroyed what's left of my sanity? Like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, because what happened next, what I discovered in those freezing waters, changed everything. It broke me. It saved me. It showed me that sometimes the very thing you think will kill you is the only thing that can make you whole again. You know, I always thought peace came in silence. After 61 years on this earth, after burying my husband 3 years ago, after watching my son move halfway across the world with his new wife, leaving me alone in this house that echoes with memories and regret, I thought silence was my friend. I thought the quiet by the lake was healing me, that those hours I spent journaling, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become, were helping me find some kind of peace. But that day, that horrible, beautiful day, silence became a warning. It became the calm before a storm that would rip my world apart and put it back together in ways I never could have imagined. I was sitting there on my usual bench, the one Robert built for me before the cancer took him, before I lost the only man who ever truly understood my pain. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I was writing in my journal, trying to capture something, anything, that might make sense of why God keeps taking the people I love and leaving me here to figure out how to breathe without them. My daughter Elaine has been gone for 7 years now. 7 years since that damn cancer stole her from me when she was only 32. 7 years of wondering what she would have become, who she would have married, what her children would have looked like. And my son David, my precious boy, he's in Australia now with Marissa, building a new life while I sit here drowning in memories of the family we used to be. The loneliness was crushing me that day, heavier than usual. Marissa had come back to town a few weeks earlier, said she needed to handle some legal papers, tie up loose ends. But something about her visits felt wrong, felt cold. She used to hug me when she saw me, used to ask about my health, my garden, my silly stories about the neighbors. But lately, she'd been distant, distracted, like she was carrying some terrible secret that was burning her from the inside out. I should have known. God help me, I should have seen the signs. I was lost in my writing when I heard the car engine. Not the gentle purr of a well-maintained vehicle, but the angry roar of someone driving too fast, too recklessly down that old dirt road. The same road Robert built with his own hands 20 years ago, back when we thought we'd have forever to walk it together, back when we believed our family would grow old and happy in this place. I looked up from my journal, shielding my eyes from the sun, and I saw her car. Marissa's car. That blue sedan I'd seen in my driveway a dozen times, the one with the small dent in the back bumper from when she backed into our mailbox last Christmas. But something was different. The way she was driving, the way she kept looking around like she was afraid someone was watching her. She parked near the water's edge, and I could see her through the trees, moving with an urgency that made my stomach twist. She was wearing gloves. Black gloves on a warm afternoon. Who wears gloves in this heat unless they're trying to hide something? I watched her pop the trunk, and my heart started racing for reasons I couldn't explain. Some primitive instinct, some motherly alarm that had been honed by years of worry and loss, was screaming at me that something was terribly wrong. She struggled with something heavy, something she clearly didn't want to be carrying, and when she finally pulled it out, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a suitcase. A dark green military-style suitcase that I recognized immediately because I was the one who gave it to her. It belonged to Robert, from his days in the service, before we met, before we built this life together. I'd given it to her months ago when she mentioned needing something sturdy for travel. But why was she bringing it here? Why was she dragging it toward the lake like it contained something she was desperate to hide? She kept glancing around, paranoid, terrified, and I pressed myself back against the tree, praying she wouldn't see me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my journal, and my heart was pounding so loud I was sure she'd hear it across the water. She reached the shore, and without hesitation, without a moment of second thought, she heaved that suitcase into the lake. Just threw it in like it was garbage, like it was something toxic she needed to get rid of before it poisoned her. The splash echoed across the water, and the sound hit me like a physical blow because somehow I knew, that whatever was in that suitcase was going to haunt me for the rest of my life. But it wasn't the splash that broke me. It wasn't the sight of my late husband's suitcase disappearing beneath the surface of the water where he used to fish every morning. It was what happened next. The suitcase didn't sink right away. It floated for a moment, bobbing on the surface like it was fighting to stay above water, like whatever was inside was struggling to survive. And then I heard it. God help me, I heard it. A sound. Muffled, desperate, barely audible over the lapping of the water against the shore. It was a cry. A human cry. Weak and terrified, and so heartbreakingly fragile that it cut through every defense I'd built around my broken heart. Marissa heard it too. I saw her freeze, saw her face go white with panic, and then she ran. She sprinted back to her car like the devil himself was chasing her, and she drove away so fast that gravel flew in every direction. She left me there, alone with that floating suitcase and the terrible knowledge that something alive was trapped inside it. I sat on that bench for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, paralyzed by fear and disbelief and a rage so pure it felt like fire in my veins. My mind was racing, trying to find some rational explanation for what I'd just witnessed. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was some kind of recording device. Maybe I was finally losing my mind like my mother did before she died, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices that existed only in my fractured imagination. But that cry, that desperate, human cry, it wouldn't leave me alone. I should have called the police right then. I should have dialed 911 and let them handle whatever horror was floating in that lake. But something deeper than logic was driving me, some primal instinct that wouldn't let me wait for help while something innocent was drowning 20 feet away from me. The lake was eerily quiet now, too quiet, like even nature was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The suitcase was still floating, but lower now, taking on water, slowly surrendering to the weight of whatever secrets it contained. And then I heard it again. Fainter this time, weaker, but still there. Still fighting. I kicked off my sandals and ran toward the water, my 61-year-old body moving faster than it had in years, driven by a desperation I hadn't felt since the day I got the call that Elaine's cancer had spread to her brain. I didn't care that the water was cold. I didn't care that I was fully clothed. I didn't care that I could barely swim anymore, that my arthritic joints screamed in protest as I dove into that lake. All I cared about was reaching that suitcase before whatever was inside it gave up fighting. The water was murky and cold, colder than I remembered from the summers when David was young and we'd come here as a family. I could barely see through the silt and algae, but I could feel the weight of that suitcase pulling me down as I wrapped my arms around it and kicked toward the surface. My lungs were burning, my muscles were screaming, but I held on because letting go meant letting someone die, and I'd already lost too many people to let death win again. When I finally broke the surface, gasping and choking on lake water, I dragged that suitcase to shore with a strength I didn't know I still possessed. The canvas was soaked and heavy, and whatever was inside had gone silent. Too silent. I was terrified that I was too late, that whatever cruel game Marissa was playing had already ended in tragedy. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely work the zipper. It was jammed, stuck with water and rust, and what looked like deliberate damage, like someone had tried to make sure it would never be opened again. I searched frantically for something to help me, finally finding a broken hairpin in my pocket, the same kind I'd used to fix David's toys when he was little, back when broken things could still be mended. I worked at that zipper with a desperation that bordered on madness, crying and cursing and praying all at the same time. And when it finally gave way, when the suitcase opened and revealed its contents, I thought my heart would stop from the sheer horror and relief of what I found. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't some gruesome evidence of a crime or some twisted trophy from a disturbed mind. It was a baby. A real, living, breathing baby boy, wrapped in what looked like a medical monitoring device, the kind they use in hospitals to track vital signs. The little screen was still blinking, still showing a heartbeat, still proving that this tiny human being was fighting to survive despite everything that had been done to him. He was so small, so pale, so still that for a moment I thought I was too late. But then he coughed, a weak little sound that was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, and water came out of his mouth. He was alive. This innocent child, this perfect little soul that someone had tried to murder, was alive. I pulled him from that suitcase and held him against my chest, feeling his tiny heart beating against mine, and I sobbed with a grief and joy so intense it felt like my soul was being torn apart and rebuilt at the same time. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely dial 911, and when the operator answered, I could barely speak through my tears. "There's a baby," I managed to choke out. "Someone tried to drown a baby. Please, you have to help him. Please." The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens and flashing lights and medical personnel who descended on our quiet lakeside like an army of angels. They took the baby from my arms, and I watched them work on him with an efficiency that spoke of experience with horrors I couldn't even imagine. They got him breathing regularly, got his body temperature stable, and rushed him to the hospital while I sat there wrapped in a blanket, trying to explain to the police what I'd witnessed. Detective Carver was a kind man with tired eyes who'd probably seen too much human cruelty in his career. He listened patiently as I told him about Marissa, about the suitcase, about the way she'd thrown it into the lake like she was disposing of evidence. He took notes and asked gentle questions and treated me like a witness rather than a suspect, which I appreciated more than he could know. But when they ran the license plate on the car I'd seen, everything became more complicated. The blue sedan belonged to Marissa, yes, but it had been reported stolen 2 days earlier. Marissa's phone number was disconnected. Her apartment was empty. It was like she'd vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only questions and a baby who shouldn't exist. The hospital called that evening with news that both relieved and terrified me. The baby was stable, healthy despite his ordeal, and appeared to be about 5 days old. But there were no hospital records of his birth. No birth certificate. No medical history. It was like he'd materialized out of thin air, which meant someone had gone to great lengths to hide his existence. But the call that came the next day destroyed what was left of my understanding of reality. Detective Carver's voice was careful, professional, but I could hear the confusion beneath his words. "Mrs. Patterson, we got the DNA results back on the baby. I need you to sit down for this, because it's going to be difficult to hear." I was already sitting, clutching my coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity, but I braced myself anyway. "The baby is your grandson, ma'am. But not through your son, David. The DNA shows he's related to you through your deceased daughter, Elaine." The coffee cup slipped from my hands and shattered on the kitchen floor, but I barely heard it over the roaring in my ears. My daughter had been dead for 7 years. 7 years. How could she have a child now? How could this baby carry her DNA when she'd been in the ground since 2018? "That's impossible," I whispered, but even as I said it, memories were surfacing. Painful memories I'd tried to bury along with my daughter. Before Elaine got sick, back when she still believed she had a future, she'd undergone IVF treatments. She'd been so hopeful, so determined to have children despite the early signs of the cancer that would eventually kill her. She'd gone through the hormone treatments, the egg retrievals, the embryo creation process. But then the cancer spread faster than anyone expected, and she died before any of the embryos could be implanted. I'd assumed they'd been destroyed. The fertility clinic had paperwork, protocols, legal requirements about what happened to unused genetic material. But apparently, someone had other plans. Detective Carver explained that the baby showed traces of fertility medications in his system, suggesting he'd been carried by a surrogate who'd used illegal methods to obtain and implant Elaine's frozen embryo. Someone had stolen my daughter's genetic legacy and tried to profit from it. The investigation that followed revealed a network of corruption that reached into places I'd never imagined. The woman I'd thought was Marissa wasn't Marissa at all. Security footage from various locations around town showed subtle facial differences, mannerisms that didn't match the woman my son had married. Someone had been impersonating my daughter-in-law for months, using her identity to gain access to family information, to learn about our history, our vulnerabilities. The real Marissa was in Australia with David, had been there the entire time. She was devastated when she learned what had happened, horrified that someone had used her identity to commit such terrible crimes. David was on the next plane home, desperate to help, to understand how our family had been targeted by such evil. It was David who helped me remember Tricia Hendricks. She'd been a nurse at the fertility clinic where Elaine had undergone treatment, a woman who'd always seemed too interested in our family's business, too eager to offer comfort and support during those dark months when we were watching my daughter die. She'd been fired from the clinic shortly after Elaine's death, officially for administrative errors, but there had been whispers about missing medications, falsified records. Detective Carver found her living under an assumed name in a town 60 miles away, working at a private medical facility that specialized in discreet reproductive services for wealthy clients. When they searched her home, they found evidence of an elaborate scheme to steal genetic material from deceased patients and sell the resulting children to couples willing to pay premium prices for babies with no legal complications. The plan had been perfect, almost undetectable. Take the embryos of dead women, implant them in desperate surrogates, and sell the babies overseas where DNA tracking would be nearly impossible. The buyers thought they were adopting legally, the surrogates thought they were helping infertile couples, and the babies disappeared into lives their genetic parents never could have imagined. But something had gone wrong with this particular transaction. The buyers had backed out at the last minute, leaving Tricia with a newborn she couldn't explain and couldn't keep. So she'd tried to eliminate the evidence, to drown my grandson in the same lake where his grandfather used to dream about the grandchildren he'd never meet. The sting operation to catch her was my idea, and Detective Carver tried everything he could to talk me out of it. But I insisted. This woman had stolen my daughter's child, had tried to murder my grandson, had violated my family in ways that would haunt me forever. I needed to look her in the eye when she was arrested. I needed her to know that her evil hadn't won. The plan was simple. I would return to the lake, pretend to have more money than an old widow should have, and offer to pay for her silence about the accident she'd witnessed. She thought I was just a confused old woman who'd stumbled onto her crime scene, not realizing that I was the grandmother of the child she'd tried to kill. The rain that night felt like a judgment from heaven, cold and relentless and angry. I sat on that same bench where I'd been journaling peacefully just days earlier, wearing a wire that felt like a spider crawling against my skin, waiting for the woman who'd tried to destroy my family. When she arrived, she looked nothing like Marissa. Now that I knew what to look for, the differences were obvious. The wrong shape of her nose, the different way she carried herself, the cold calculation in her eyes that my real daughter-in-law had never possessed. She was wearing black, head to toe, like she was attending a funeral. Maybe she was. Maybe she thought she was burying the last witness to her crimes. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice a sick parody of Marissa's warm tone. "I heard you found something in the lake. Something that upset you." I forced myself to stay calm, to play the role of a frightened old woman who could be bought or intimidated into silence. But inside, I was burning with a rage so pure it felt holy. "I saw what you did," I whispered, making my voice shake with fake fear. "I saw you throw that suitcase in the water. But I won't tell anyone if you help me understand. If you make sure my family is safe." She smiled then, a predator's smile that made my skin crawl. Smart woman. Sometimes accidents happen by lakes. Sometimes old people slip and fall, and no one finds them for days. That's when she told me everything. How she'd been planning this for years, waiting for the right combination of circumstances. How she'd studied my family, learned our routines, our vulnerabilities. How she'd stolen Elaine's embryos and carried my grandson to term, planning to sell him to the highest bidder. How the adoption had fallen through at the last minute, leaving her with a baby she needed to dispose of quietly. "Your daughter was so naive," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Talking about her future children, about the legacy she wanted to leave behind. She never realized that some legacies are worth more as commodities than as love. The recording device captured every word, every casual admission of the horrors she'd inflicted on my family. But it was what she said next that broke something fundamental inside me. The baby would have died anyway. Babies die all the time. At least this way, his death would have served a purpose. It would have eliminated the evidence of my business arrangement. She pulled a knife then, a long, silver blade that gleamed in the rain like a shard of moonlight. "But now you've complicated things, Mrs. Patterson. Now I have to clean up more than one mess." I pressed the panic button they'd given me, and within seconds the woods around the lake exploded with movement. Police officers emerged from behind trees and bushes like shadows coming to life, surrounding this woman who'd tried to profit from my daughter's death and my grandson's murder. She fought, of course. People like her always fight when they're cornered, lashing out like wounded animals. She swung that knife wildly, screaming about her rights, her plans, her careful work being ruined by an interfering old woman. But the officers were professionals, and within minutes she was on the ground, handcuffed, reading rights she'd never afforded to the families she'd destroyed. As they led her away, she looked back at me with eyes full of hate and said the words that will haunt me until I die. "You think you've won something, but that baby will never be normal. He'll never be whole. Children who survive what he survived always carry the damage. You've saved a broken thing, and it will break your heart all over again." I wanted to kill her in that moment. I wanted to take that knife she'd threatened me with and drive it into her cold, calculating heart. But I didn't, because my grandson needed me to be better than the evil that had tried to destroy him. He needed me to choose love over vengeance, hope over despair. The trial was a media circus that I tried to avoid, but some details filtered through the lawyers and social workers who'd become constant presences in my life. Tricia Hendricks was convicted on multiple charges of kidnapping, fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy. She'd been running her baby-selling operation for over 3 years, and investigators found evidence of at least 12 other children who'd been stolen and sold through her network. Some were recovered and reunited with relatives. Others had disappeared into the international adoption market and might never be found. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but that felt like cold comfort compared to the damage she'd done. How do you quantify the pain of families who'd been robbed of their genetic legacy? How do you compensate grandparents who'd lost grandchildren they never knew existed? But through all the legal proceedings, all the paperwork and interviews and psychological evaluations, there was one bright spot that kept me sane. The baby. My grandson. Elaine's son. The hospital staff started calling him Miracle Boy because his survival defied every medical probability. He should have drowned. He should have suffered brain damage from oxygen deprivation. He should have died from hypothermia or infection or any of a dozen other complications from his ordeal. Instead, he thrived. He gained weight and developed normally and showed no signs of the trauma that should have marked him for life. It was like God had wrapped him in protection, like Elaine's spirit had somehow shielded her son from the evil that tried to destroy him. The adoption process was complicated because of the unusual circumstances, but the DNA evidence was undeniable. This child was my blood, my family, my responsibility, and my joy. I named him Eli James, after Elaine's favorite Bible verse about God restoring souls. Eli for the prophet who heard God's voice even when others couldn't, and James for my husband, who would have loved this boy beyond measure. Bringing Eli home was like being reborn myself. After years of living in a house filled with ghosts and regrets, suddenly there was laughter again. There were sleepless nights and dirty diapers and the beautiful chaos of new life demanding attention and love. My arthritic hands learned to change diapers and mix formula and soothe a crying infant with a gentleness I'd forgotten I possessed. David came home from Australia and wept when he held his nephew for the first time. "He looks like Elaine," he whispered, and I saw the truth of it in Eli's eyes, in the shape of his nose, in the way he grasped at everything within reach like he was determined to hold on to life with both hands. The real Marissa flew in a week later, and when she met Eli, she broke down completely. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry someone used my face, my name, to hurt your family. I'm so sorry you had to go through this alone." But I wasn't alone anymore. I had Eli. I had this perfect, impossible gift that had emerged from the darkest chapter of my life like a flower blooming in a graveyard. Every morning when I woke up to his hungry cries, every evening when I rocked him to sleep in the chair where I used to sit alone with my grief, I felt Elaine's presence. I felt her joy that her son was alive, her gratitude that he was loved, her peace that he was safe. The lake looks different now when I sit by the water with Eli in my arms. It's not a place of secrets and horror anymore, but a place of resurrection. The water that nearly took his life also delivered him to mine. The suitcase that was meant to be his coffin became the vessel of his salvation. People ask me if I'm angry, if I hate the woman who tried to steal my grandson's life. And yes, there's anger. There's a rage that burns in my chest like swallowed fire when I think about what she did, what she tried to do, what she would have done if I hadn't been sitting by that lake at exactly the right moment. There's fury at a system that allowed her to operate for years, stealing and selling children like they were merchandise instead of human souls. But the anger is overwhelmed by something stronger. Gratitude. Wonder. The absolute amazement that God took the worst thing that could have happened to my family and transformed it into the greatest blessing I've ever received. Eli is here because evil tried to destroy him and failed. He's here because love is stronger than hate, because hope floats even when everything else sinks. I thought I'd lost both my children. I thought my line was ending with me, that I'd die alone in this house with nothing but memories and regrets to keep me company. But God sent me one back through water and mercy. Evil tried to drown innocence, but love never sank. Love never sinks. Every night when I put Eli to bed, I tell him about his mother. I tell him how beautiful she was, how kind, how determined to fight for the family she wanted even when cancer was eating her alive. I tell him about his grandfather Robert, who would have taught him to fish in the same lake where he was almost murdered, who would have built him toy boats and helped him catch fireflies on summer evenings. I tell him about David and Marissa, who are planning to move back from Australia so he can grow up knowing his uncle and aunt. I tell him about the extended family of cousins and great-aunts and family friends who are already planning his first birthday party, his first Christmas, his first everything. But mostly, I tell him that he's loved, that he's wanted, that he survived for a reason, and that reason is to fill the world with the same light his mother carried, the same hope his grandfather held onto even when he was dying, the same determination to choose good over evil that has defined our family for generations. The legal battles aren't over. There are still depositions and appeals and civil suits that will drag on for years. There are other families affected by Trisha's crimes who deserve justice and closure. There are reforms needed in the fertility industry to prevent this kind of theft from happening again. But tonight, as I sit in my rocking chair with Eli sleeping against my chest, listening to his peaceful breathing and feeling his tiny heart beating steady and strong, none of that matters. What matters is that evil tried to win and failed. What matters is that a baby who should have died is alive and healthy and loved beyond measure. What matters is that sometimes, when you think God has forgotten you, when you think you've lost everything worth living for, He sends you exactly what you need in the most impossible way. He sends you a suitcase that moves when it should be still, a cry that cuts through despair, a reason to dive into dark water without counting the cost. If this story has touched your heart, if you felt even a fraction of the pain and joy and wonder that I've experienced these past months, then share it. Tell someone else that miracles still happen, that love still wins, that there's always hope floating just beneath the surface of our darkest moments. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, but more importantly, tell me what you would have done if you saw that suitcase move. Would you have called the police and waited for help? Would you have walked away and pretended you saw nothing? Or would you have kicked off your shoes and dove into the water, knowing that sometimes saving a life means risking your own? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us that in a world full of darkness, there are still people willing to be light. There are still grandmothers who will fight monsters to save their grandchildren. There are still miracles floating in the most unlikely places, waiting for someone brave enough to reach out and pull them to shore. Because hope always floats. Love always rises. And sometimes, just sometimes, the thing that breaks your heart is the same thing that makes you whole again.